The morning sun rose over Willow Creek Estates, a neighborhood so perfectly trimmed it looked more like a magazine cover than a place people actually lived. The lawns were measured, hedges symmetrical, and even the birds seemed to sing on schedule. But that illusion of order cracked the day a small trailer rolled onto Lot 47, and with it, a man named Evan Hale. He wasn't what the neighborhood expected. No family, no fancy car, no mansion-sized mortgage. Just a tiny house on wheels, handcrafted with cedar siding and solar panels, quietly parked at the corner lot that had sat empty for years. To him, it was freedom. To the homeowners association, it was an eyesore. Within hours, whispers rippled through the cul-de-sac. Curtains twitched. A woman named Carolyn Denton, the HOA president, stood on her porch clutching a clipboard like a weapon. "He can't just live there," she hissed to her neighbor. "This isn't a trailer park." Evan worked silently, oblivious to the gathering storm. He painted his porch a soft pine green, planted wildflowers, and hung a wind chime that danced in the breeze. Children passing by loved his little house. It looked like something from a fairy tale. But the adults? They saw rebellion. A threat to their uniform perfection. The first letter came 2 days later. A notice of non-compliance. Then another. And another. They mocked him in community meetings, laughing at his toy house, calling it a shed with windows. Someone even slipped a note under his door that read, "You don't belong here." Evan didn't respond. He just stood at his window one evening, watching the golden sunset melt over the rooftops, listening to the faint hum of sprinklers. His reflection in the glass looked calm, but his heart carried a quiet ache, not of defeat, but of patience. Because what no one in Willow Creek knew was that Evan's father had once owned a piece of this very land, long before the HOA existed. And in a few days, a man with a measuring rod and a map would arrive at his gate, marking lines that would change everything. Before Willow Creek became a neighborhood of white fences and HOA bylaws, it was a stretch of land called Hale Meadow, a name almost no one remembered. Evan did. He used to walk there as a boy, holding his father's rough hand, the smell of wild clover and soil thick in the air. His father, Richard Hale, was a local carpenter, a man who built homes not to impress, but to last. When his father passed away, the land was divided and sold off piece by piece to developers. Evan left town, studied sustainable architecture, and traveled across the country building tiny houses for families who couldn't afford the dream of big living. He loved the simplicity, how a few hundred square feet could still hold warmth, laughter, and pride. Years later, when he returned home and found that the last unsold parcel of his father's old land was still available, the corner lot of Willow Creek, he took it as a sign. He bought it quietly, built his dream home with his own hands, and thought maybe, just maybe, the town would welcome him back. For a while, it seemed like they might. The children from next door, Ellie and Sam, used to visit while he worked, asking endless questions. He showed them how to measure planks, hammer safely, and fit solar panels that gleamed like mirrors under the sun. Their laughter echoed through the yard, and even some adults admired his craftsmanship, at first. But that peace didn't last. At the monthly HOA barbecue, Evan was introduced as the minimalist guy, the one who'd rather live in a shoebox than pay property tax like the rest of us. Laughter followed, polite but cutting. Carolyn Denton, a former realtor turned self-appointed neighborhood queen, found it concerning that his house didn't match the aesthetic standards. "He's setting a precedent," she told the board. "If we let this slide, what's next? Campers? Shacks?" They began sending letters about structural nonconformity and architectural disharmony. Evan attended one meeting to explain his build met county codes and that his home's design was fully permitted, but the board waved him off. They weren't quoting county law. They were quoting their own rules. It wasn't just the HOA. Neighbors who once waved stopped waving. Kids were told to stay off his lawn. One man deliberately blew grass clippings against his tiny home every morning as if to mark his dominance. The mail carrier began delivering letters from the HOA with little sticky notes. "Sorry, they're at it again." Evan stayed calm, reminding himself of his father's words, "You can't build peace with noise. Let silence do the heavy lifting." So he stayed silent, and listened. He noticed Carolyn's husband walking the property lines late at night with a flashlight and a clipboard. He noticed a surveyor's truck parked across the street one afternoon, taking photos and measurements. He noticed how the HOA meetings became less about community and more about him. Something was brewing. Then, one morning, he found small orange flags stabbed into the soil along his driveway, markers he hadn't placed. The boundary lines looked different. Moved. A few inches here, a few feet there. Subtle, but intentional. When he asked about it, Carolyn smiled a little too easily. "Oh, don't worry, just standard maintenance. We're updating property maps." But something in her tone felt off. That night, Evan sat at his desk and opened his father's old land deed. It was yellowed with age but clear. The Hale property line extended farther than the HOA's new map suggested, by exactly one lot. He folded the paper carefully, looked out through his window at the moonlight touching the flags, and felt something shift inside him. Not anger, just clarity. Willow Creek had always been obsessed with order, but beneath its perfect lawns and rulebooks, there was greed, fear, and pride. And Evan, quiet as he seemed, wasn't about to let his father's legacy be trimmed down like another hedge in Carolyn Denton's world. The next morning, he saw a man in a reflective vest walking up his path, a surveyor, clipboard in hand, scanning the land like he already owned it. Evan stepped outside, greeted him politely, and watched as the man hesitated before saying, "Just routine mapping for the HOA, sir." Evan smiled faintly, then turned back toward his tiny house. The wind chimes sang softly behind him. The cracks were widening. And for the first time, Evan realized, this wasn't just about his tiny house. It was about who really owned the ground beneath their perfect lawns. The next week, Evan noticed the first real sign that something was wrong. His property tax notice came in the mail, but the square footage listed was smaller than before. By several feet. At first, he thought it was an error. But when he checked the county's GIS map online, the outline of his lot had changed. A sliver of land, just wide enough for a driveway and a strip of lawn, had been reassigned to Lot 48, Carolyn Denton's property. His stomach turned cold. He opened his filing cabinet and pulled out his documents, the original survey, the deed, the purchase agreement, each one showing his father's boundary lines. They hadn't just moved a fence or a flag. They had redrawn the property itself. That night, he walked the perimeter with a flashlight. The orange flags glowed faintly in the dark, slicing through the grass like a warning. Someone had even shifted his gravel driveway markers, subtle, quiet, but deliberate. The HOA had stolen land before his very eyes, and they'd done it with paperwork. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his small wooden desk beneath the humming solar lamp, studying every document, comparing every coordinate. His father's voice echoed in his head, "Never fight fools in their noise. Build your truth quietly." By morning, his quiet truth was starting to take shape. At the town records office, he found what he suspected. The HOA had submitted a corrected plat map a month ago, claiming there had been an old boundary error dating back to the original sale of the lots. The correction had conveniently added 22 feet of Evan's land to Carolyn's property, giving her space for a future gazebo she'd mentioned at last month's meeting. And the most chilling part? The document had a forged signature, his. Someone had pretended he'd consented to the adjustment. He stared at the signature for a long time. It wasn't even a good forgery. But it was enough for the county clerk, who approved it without question because it bore the HOA's stamp. When Evan walked out of the building, the world looked sharper, colder. The same neighborhood that once smelled like morning dew and cedar now felt mechanical, rehearsed, every lawn, every smile hiding a scheme. He didn't confront anyone that day. Not the HOA board. Not Carolyn. Not the smug neighbor who mowed half an inch over his line now, just to make a point. Instead, he made a quiet promise to himself. He walked to the back of his tiny house, past the garden bed where the first wildflowers were blooming, and whispered the words like a vow, "I won't fight in anger. I'll wait." Then he began watching. He noticed the HOA's landscaper trucks arriving earlier than usual, marking trees and soil. He overheard Carolyn bragging to another board member about expanding her outdoor area once things are finalized. And late one evening, as the streetlights flickered on, he saw her standing on what used to be his land, wine glass in hand, showing it off to guests like it had always been hers. Each sight burned a little deeper, but he kept his silence. He started documenting everything: photos, timestamps, satellite maps. Every discrepancy, every conversation. He visited the county archives, scanning old blueprints. He reached out to an old college friend, Mara Lynn, now a real estate attorney, asking her hypothetical questions about property disputes between an HOA and an individual homeowner. Mara listened quietly, then said, "Evan, if what you're describing is true, they're not just violating your rights, they're committing fraud." He thanked her, hung up, and exhaled slowly. From that night on, his small cedar house became a quiet command center. The hum of his printer replaced the sound of the wind chime. Every document, every photo went into a neat folder labeled simply, 47. The neighborhood continued mocking his home, calling it a box with windows, laughing as they passed by. Carolyn smirked when their eyes met at the mailbox, unaware that the man she mocked was already 2 steps ahead, waiting for the right moment. Because when truth takes root in silence, it doesn't grow like grass. It grows like oak, slow, deep, and unstoppable. The spring rain came early that year, washing over Willow Creek like a quiet cleansing. To everyone else, it was another season of blooming roses and fresh paint on fences. To Evan, it was the perfect cover for what he was about to do. By day, he lived as they expected, mowing his small yard, smiling faintly at neighbors, occasionally waving at passing cars. By night, he became something else entirely, a strategist. His desk, once scattered with building tools, was now lined with legal documents, topographic maps, and a laptop filled with scanned records. He'd taken Mara Lynn's advice seriously. "Don't confront them," she'd said. "Document them. Every word, every action. Then we'll let the law speak." So he did. He began visiting the county assessor's office twice a week, pulling old maps dating back 30 years. He cross-referenced deeds, tracing ownership history of every parcel that once belonged to his father. He noticed something remarkable: the HOA's founding plat contained an unresolved clause, a restrictive covenant that expired after 25 years unless renewed by all property owners. That clause had expired 6 months ago. Without unanimous renewal, many of the HOA's current restrictions, including its authority to redraw maps, were legally void. But they didn't know that yet. Next, Evan hired a licensed surveyor, quietly and privately, someone from out of town, not connected to the HOA. They came one foggy morning, their truck unmarked, their equipment hidden under tarps. Together, they measured every inch of the lot. The results were conclusive. The HOA's correction had indeed stolen 22.4 feet of Evan's property. Evan paid in cash, thanked the surveyor, and stored the signed report in his 47 folder. He then reached out to a title company under the guise of selling his home, requesting a title history for the entire row of lots, 45 through 49. The clerk raised an eyebrow but processed the request. 2 days later, he received the files, and what he found made his pulse quicken. Carolyn Denton's lot, Lot 48, contained an irregular annotation, an amended description, approved only by the HOA, not the county. It was technically invalid, and yet, somehow, the county had accepted it, likely pushed through by a friendly local surveyor. Evan finally understood. The HOA wasn't acting rogue. It was acting dirty. But he didn't storm into a meeting. He didn't send threats or rants online. Instead, he started attending HOA meetings again, quiet, polite, and observant. He sat at the back, taking notes, smiling faintly as Carolyn rattled off agenda items about lawn heights and garbage bins. Once, during the open comment period, he stood and said, "I appreciate everyone's commitment to order. It's important that we all respect the land we live on." It sounded harmless, but Carolyn's expression flickered. She knew he was hinting at something. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Evan worked with Mara, who began compiling a civil complaint. She suggested waiting until they had not just evidence of the boundary theft, but proof of intentional fraud, the forged signature. So Evan set a trap. He requested, in writing, a full copy of the HOA's corrected plat submission, as required by law for any affected property owner. Carolyn, confident and dismissive, emailed it directly, with the same forged signature attached. That one email became the smoking gun. Over the next month, Evan and Mara assembled the case. Every timestamp, every photo, every document had its place. They even found that the HOA had used association funds, neighborhood dues, to pay for the mapping adjustment. That meant every homeowner, unknowingly, had funded the fraud. The irony was poetic. The same people who mocked his tiny house had financed their own downfall. In May, when the magnolias bloomed across Willow Creek, Evan walked the neighborhood again. The air was calm, the lawns glowed green, and the HOA was busy preparing its annual summer gala. Carolyn was in full command, decorating banners that read, "Celebrating Community Integrity." Evan passed by, smiled, and tipped his hat. She smiled back, unaware that just 3 miles away, in the county courthouse, a file marked Hale vs. Willow Creek HOA had been stamped and accepted. The claim included property fraud, falsified documentation, and misuse of community funds. As he walked home, the evening light fell perfectly on his little house, the home they mocked, the one built by his hands and protected by his silence. He opened his window, let the wind chimes sing, and whispered to himself with a calm, almost peaceful certainty, "They have no idea what's coming." The hearing took place on a Wednesday morning in early June. The courthouse stood at the edge of town, framed by oak trees that swayed gently in the summer wind. Inside, the air carried that faint blend of paper, polish, and tension, the smell of truth about to surface. Evan sat quietly at the petitioner's table, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. Across the aisle sat Carolyn Denton, flanked by 2 HOA board members and their attorney, a silver-haired man with a too-perfect tie and an air of practiced confidence. They whispered, smirked, and looked his way as though certain this was a misunderstanding that would vanish once the judge heard their version. Judge Martha Kellerman, known for her sharp wit and no-nonsense demeanor, entered the courtroom. "Good morning. Let's get started. Case of Hale vs. Willow Creek Homeowners Association." Evan's attorney, Mara Lynn, stood. Calm, concise, and poised, she began. "Your Honor, this case concerns a deliberate act of boundary fraud committed by the HOA and its board president, Mrs. Denton, involving forged consent, falsified documents, and misuse of association funds." The defense scoffed. Their attorney responded smoothly, "Your Honor, my clients acted entirely within standard HOA procedure, correcting an outdated plat map to maintain neighborhood uniformity." The petitioner simply misunderstood. Evan said nothing. He didn't need to. Mara opened a large binder and slid a series of documents across the bench. Exhibit A, the original land deed from 1996, signed by Richard Hale, Evan's father, clearly showing the true property lines. Exhibit B, the county-approved map from 2010. Exhibit C, the HOA's corrected plat, submitted this year, containing a forged signature from my client. Judge Kellerman adjusted her glasses. "Forged?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mara replied. "My client's signature was falsified and used to reassign part of his property to the HOA president's parcel. We've had it examined by a handwriting expert." She placed two documents side by side, one from Evan's deed purchase, and the other from the HOA correction. The signature discrepancy was obvious, even to the untrained eye. The courtroom grew still. Carolyn's face paled. Her attorney leaned over, whispering urgently, but she stared straight ahead, eyes darting nervously toward the judge. Mara continued, Exhibit D, proof that HOA funds, collected from homeowners' dues, were used to pay for the survey and legal filings of this false correction. Meaning, Your Honor, every homeowner unknowingly financed this act of fraud. The judge leaned back, silent for a moment. Mrs. Denton, would you like to explain why your association filed a new map with an unauthorized signature? Carolyn cleared her throat, her voice trembling. It was a clerical mix-up. I assumed Mr. Hale had signed off through the board's consent form. We were just trying to maintain community standards. By expanding your backyard by 22 feet? Mara asked gently, her tone razor-sharp beneath its calm. Carolyn's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Evan sat motionless, hands folded, eyes steady on the wooden desk before him. The courtroom's fluorescent hum faded away, all he could hear was the faint echo of his father's voice, never fight in anger. Build the truth. Mara presented the final piece, the independent survey report Evan had commissioned. It overlaid perfectly with his father's original deed, proving the HOA's correction was false. When she finished, there was a silence so deep it almost rang. Judge Kellerman finally spoke, her voice low but decisive. Mrs. Denton, I've reviewed the evidence. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a serious misuse of authority, and a violation of both county and state property law. She paused, then turned to Evan. Mr. Hale, your patience in handling this matter is commendable. Not many would have pursued it so quietly or thoroughly. Carolyn looked as though she'd aged 10 years in a minute. The judge continued, this court hereby nullifies the HOA's corrected plat, reinstates the original property boundaries, and orders restitution for all legal and survey expenses incurred by the petitioner. Furthermore, due to misuse of HOA funds and falsification of documents, this case will be referred to the district attorney for review. Then came the part no one expected. The judge added, given the association's breach of its own charter and the expired covenant authority, the Willow Creek HOA is hereby dissolved pending reformation under independent supervision. Mara blinked. So did Evan. It meant not only was his land restored, but the HOA itself, the power structure that mocked and bullied him, was legally dismantled. Carolyn's attorney stammered, trying to protest, but the gavel struck once, sharp, final, echoing through the courtroom like thunder. Evan exhaled for the first time in months. Outside, the morning light broke through the clouds. Reporters and homeowners had begun gathering, word spreading faster than the wind. Carolyn left the courthouse quickly, face red, surrounded by flashing cameras. Other residents approached Evan quietly, some apologetic, some simply awed. Did you know this would happen? One man asked. Evan smiled faintly. I just knew the truth had roots. You can't bury it forever. That evening, Willow Creek was silent. The HOA website went offline. The "No Tiny Homes Allowed" signs came down. And on the once mocked corner lot, Evan sat on his porch steps, sipping coffee as the sunset painted his cedar walls gold. Across the street, Carolyn's yard sat empty, the gazebo project halted mid-foundation, her property tied up in legal review. The neighborhood that once laughed at the tiny house now watched it with quiet respect, or perhaps, quiet shame. And when the wind picked up, the chime above his door began to sing again, soft, steady, and free. Weeks passed, and Willow Creek slowly changed. The gossip quieted. The fences stopped gleaming under forced perfection. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt human. The HOA sign at the entrance was gone. The manicured flowers wilted from neglect, but no one seemed to mind. People began waving again, not because rules required it, but because they remembered what community actually meant. Evan kept to his quiet routine. He rebuilt the garden bed that the survey stakes had once scarred, planting wildflowers in every spot they disturbed. He fixed his rain barrel, sanded the porch, and replaced one broken wind chime with a new one made from brass and glass, soft tones that carried across the street like forgiveness. Children came by again. Ellie and Sam brought drawings of his tiny house, calling it the fairy tale home. Their parents stood nearby, smiling sheepishly, as if unsure whether to apologize or thank him. Evan just nodded and said, "You're always welcome here." In time, a new neighborhood association formed, smaller, kinder, focused on real upkeep and community service rather than control. Evan was invited to join. He declined, politely, saying, "You don't need me at the table. You just need to remember why you're building it." On quiet evenings, he'd sit outside with his coffee, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops that once judged him. The same light that once made his tiny house look out of place now made it look like the heart of the street, warm, simple, alive. He often thought of his father. How Richard Hale had built with honesty, not ambition. How he'd told him, long ago, the land doesn't belong to the loudest voice, son. It belongs to the one who listens to it. Evan finally understood. Justice hadn't been about winning. It had been about restoring balance, between pride and peace, arrogance and truth. And when silence had done its work, it spoke louder than any gavel ever could. He stood, stretched, and smiled as the evening breeze carried the soft, steady sound of the wind chime. "Peace," he whispered. That's all I ever wanted. Clapperboard if you enjoy stories of smart, emotional justice, where truth wins without shouting. Subscribe for more real-life inspired HOA tales. Because sometimes, the smallest house carries the biggest victory.